Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Esses, and on behalf of Pathways to Prosperity, I'd like to welcome you to this very important workshop on measuring welcoming communities. I'll be moderating this workshop today. And to start, I just want to say that we have English-French translation for the workshop. So although all of our speakers will be speaking in English, you can choose to have closed captioning in either English or French. Can we have the first slide, please? So as you can see on the slide, in order to enable closed captioning, please click on the Show Captions option on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you can't see this option, you should be able to find it under the More button. And so for those of you who would like to have closed captioning in French, click on the upward arrow next to the Show Captions option, and then you'll have to enable translation and select French as your preferred caption language. For those of you who'd like to have closed captioning in English, the translation does not have to be enabled, and Zoom will automatically use the transcript to display the closed captionings. Can I have the next slide, please? So you may also want to set your speaking language in case you want to raise your hand and ask a question verbally during the Q&A portion of this workshop. To do that, set your speaking language to the language you'll speak in, and be sure that the caption language is the language you want your captions to appear in. Okay, so now before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am today at Western University in London, Ontario, which is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Chinookan nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. I'd also like to recognize the 3 First Nation communities that are neighboring the City of London. This includes Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. Please consider the lands on which you reside and the Indigenous nations whose traditional territory they may be. Now, I'm very excited to introduce today's workshop, which will feature information on the Measuring Welcoming Communities Toolkit, the experiences of a LIP that has used various tools from the toolkit, and where to obtain data to assess the indicators for specific characteristics of a welcoming community, as listed in the toolkit. Let me introduce our speakers. So our speakers today are Leah Hamilton, who is Vice Dean, Research and Community Relations in the Faculty of Business, Communication Studies, and Aviation at Mount Royal University. Leah will introduce the toolkit and the various tools within it. Our second speaker will be Carolyn Amonte, who is Regional Program Manager of Settlement and Language at the Columbia Basin Alliance for Literacy. Carolyn will discuss her experiences using the toolkit. Our third speaker will be Alina Sutter, who is Research Associate at Pathways to Prosperity. And Alina will discuss data sources for measuring the characteristics of a welcoming community, particularly publicly available and subscription-based sources of data. And finally, good news, Oshiog Bell, who is a researcher at University of Western Ontario, will present on how to use surveys to measure the indicators for various characteristics, giving examples of survey questions from previous surveys used by various LIPs. Please note that the presentations and a video of this session will be posted on the P2P website in the next couple of days in case you'd like to review it. So if you've missed anything or you want more details, everything will be posted after the session. Also, following the presentations, we'll have time for the speakers to answer some questions. Please use the Zoom Q&A button rather than the chat at the bottom of your screen for inputting questions. If you can't see the Q&A button, try clicking the More button and it should be one of the options available. We'll hold the Q&A session after all of our speakers have presented. However, you can type in your questions throughout the session, and you can also upvote questions typed in by others. During the Q&A period, we'll address the input questions first, those that are typed in, And after that, we may also have time for people to raise their hands and ask questions verbally. We encourage you to turn on your camera when asking a question. So on to our first speaker, Leah Hamilton. Over to you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Vicki. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here. As Vicki said, I'm Leah Hamilton, and I'm coming to you from Mount Royal University and Treaty 7 in Calgary. I'm really happy to be here to talk about some of the work that I've done in collaboration with Victoria Esses and some incredible PhD students, Awish Aslam and Priscilla Prado-Barros. And my role here today is really to set the stage for the rest of the workshop by providing an overview of the Measuring Welcoming Communities Toolkit, which is publicly available on the P2P website. Next slide, please. So I'm going to dive right in and I'm going to talk about the definition that we use of a welcoming community. And this is rooted in our review of existing definitions, and of course there are many, and of the literature in this space. And a welcoming community can be defined as a collective effort to design and sustain a place where immigrants feel they belong and that supports immigrants' economic, sociocultural, and civic and political integration. And a welcoming community has structures, processes, and practices in place to meet the needs and promote the inclusion of immigrants in all aspects of life. And it actively works to ensure that these structures, processes, and practices are in fact effective. So next slide, please. The toolkits that we've created, and there are two of them, they focus on two things. So first, they focus on what characteristics actually constitute a welcoming community and how we can go about measuring those characteristics. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And then the second toolkit, which is a conversation for a different day, focuses on how we can actually promote communities that are more welcoming. I'll just ask you to mute your mic if you are in the meet and not speaking. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. Thank you so much. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so when we think about working toward creating a welcoming community, in our toolkit, we propose a 5-step approach. So step 1 is to really assess the current state of the community. And you're going to hear more later from Carolyn about how this was done. But we really can't begin until we have that baseline assessment of where are we now. And then from there, we move to step 2, which is about creating short and long-term goals. So looking at that baseline, thinking about our current status, like where are we at when it comes to being a welcoming community? And then what are those short-term and long-term goals that we want to work toward? So from there, anytime we have goals, we implement or adjust or tweak policies and programs that are going to help us target gaps or target weaknesses and sort of close that space between where we are now and where we want to be. Following that, after some time has elapsed, and we can talk later about how much time, it depends on what we're working toward, we would then do sort of a systematic evaluation to assess the effectiveness of those policies or programs that the community has put into place. And then from there, step 5 is about this ongoing assessment of the state of the community, which then feeds back into step 2. So the idea is that this is a circular or sort of iterative process. It's never done. Like many things, when it comes to communities, it's complicated. It's a bit nonlinear, and we should constantly be looking at things again and tweaking and assessing. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to now dive a little bit further into Toolkit 1, and this toolkit contains a few key things. Where I'll spend most of my time today is around the characteristics of a welcoming community, so talking about those and how we came up with them, and then talking about the indicators for each of those 19 characteristics, because then later, Alina and Good News will tell you a little bit about some of the data sources that you can use to assess those indicators. Next slide, please. So a little bit about this toolkit. It is available in both English and French. and it contains a set of questions that LIPs and RIFs and municipalities and others can use to conduct an environmental scan and identify crucial features of a community that may influence approaches to assessing and working towards a more welcoming community. So those might be, anything from geography, rural versus urban, local labor markets, these types of things that might affect an approach that a community is going to take. So we also have a checklist that communities or municipalities and others can use to rank the order of the relative importance of the 19 characteristics to your community at this point in time. And then we also have a checklist to choose which indicators will be used to assess the selected characteristics and what comparisons you're going to make using the indicators. This might sound a little bit complicated, so we'll start walking you through these in a bit more detail. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so when thinking about what characteristics make a community welcoming, I do want to mention a few things. And these are really important, and that is really the recognition of context. So the importance of each characteristic, and there's 19 of them that I'll walk you through, is really going to vary somewhat from community to community. So that's why it's important to have these conversations at the local level. Can even depend on time. Like from year to year, things vary within communities. So that's important. And we also recognize that characteristics are likely to be mutually reinforcing, and they sort of interact or build upon or reduce the impact of each other. So what that means is it's really challenging to look at each of these characteristics in isolation because we recognize the complexity of communities and how these characteristics impact one another. And then finally, we want to mention that characteristics must take into account the needs of multi-barriered immigrants. So for example, racialized women, youth, seniors, 2S LGBTQIA+, individuals, refugees, immigrants with disabilities, and so on. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so developing this final rank ordered list of characteristics was actually quite challenging, as you can imagine. So I am going to walk you through sort of 3 clusters of characteristics. And we found quite a bit of consensus in the literature that the top 5 characteristics, so we call these cluster A, are sort of the core, most important characteristics of a welcoming community. But we do want you to note that the rankings of the characteristics within the clusters are pretty tentative. And that's why you'll notice we don't rank them as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We just list them. So in cluster A, so again, these are the characteristics that typically speaking are the core, most important characteristics of a welcoming community. These are access to affordable, adequate, and suitable housing, employment and entrepreneurship opportunities, access to suitable healthcare, and that includes mental health care. That's really important here. Positive attitudes toward immigrants of all racial, cultural, and religious backgrounds, and then access to immigrant serving agencies that meet immigrants' needs. Okay, next slide. So now we're into cluster B. So we found some consensus that the next 5 characteristics are also quite important. And these are access to transportation, educational opportunities, ongoing commitment to anti-racism and anti-oppression, access to services and supports for French-speaking immigrants by French speakers, and immigrant-responsive municipal features and services. Next slide. And then finally, into cluster C, we found some consensus about these last 9 characteristics, but typically speaking, when we look across communities, we would say that these have a little bit of a lower importance. And these are coordination and collaboration among community organizations in different levels of government that are working toward welcoming communities, equitable neighborhoods, opportunities to form and join social and community networks, immigrant responsive police services and justice system, access to inclusive public spaces, facilities, and programs, positive Indigenous immigrant relations and understanding, access to diverse religious and ethnocultural organizations, civic and political participation opportunities, and equitable media coverage, representation, and content. And just to reiterate, the clustering of the characteristics and the ordering of the three clusters is more definitive than the ranking of the characteristics within each cluster. I hope that makes sense. And I also want to acknowledge that the rank ordering of characteristics provided here is a generalization, and that may not apply to all communities. So the importance of each characteristics for a given community will depend on several factors. So for instance, a community's size and a community's location. So is a community smaller or larger? What's its proximity to other communities? What's the regional and local economy, labor market, housing market? What are the sort of community demographic composition and trends? And even unanticipated events that may significantly impact a community, whether that's a crisis or a climate emergency, and so on. So we also know that the importance of characteristics are going to change over time because communities are constantly evolving. So when we use this toolkit to assess the extent to which a community is welcoming, we encourage communities to use the checklist to determine their own rank ordering. And again, Carolyn will walk you through an example later. Okay, next slide. So let's move to indicators now. What do I mean by indicators? What I mean by an indicator is a quantitative and a qualitative and qualitative measures that can be used to assess the level of each of those 19 characteristics that we just talked about in each community. So these indicators are available online from the P2P website. There's hundreds of, well, no, definitely more than 100. We have tons of them, and we have checklists for each characteristics that provide examples of possible indicators and comparisons. So just to give you an example, if we were talking about that housing characteristic, the access to affordable, adequate, and suitable housing, one indicator would be housing affordability. So the percentage of before tax household income that's spent on housing. So that's an example. Okay, so next slide, please. So a few things about the indicators. We strongly encourage communities to examine multiple indicators for each of the characteristics because some can be measured objectively, like the one I just talked about for housing, that idea of housing affordability. But others are based on perception, so people's satisfaction with their housing, for example. But both of these things are really important. So it's important for communities to choose multiple indicators for each of those 19 characteristics. Okay, next slide. The other thing that we provide is a helpful tool for communities to choose what comparisons they're going to use. So when we think about indicators, it's important to compare them to non-immigrants in the community whenever possible. And Good News and Alina will walk you through some ways that you can do that through surveys and other data sources. It's also important to look at comparisons to previous cohorts of immigrants in the community and to other communities or provincial territorial averages. As I mentioned in that 5-step process I walked you through, we also want to think about comparisons before and after new initiatives are implemented. And we want to look at comparisons among different groups of immigrants, including multi-barriered groups. So we really want to look at these things holistically. Okay, next slide, please. So I wanted to give you one example of how comprehensive these lists of indicators are. And so here's some indicators for the characteristic on access to affordable, adequate, and suitable housing. And I won't read each of these to you, but as you can see, we have housing affordability and other sort of objective housing indicators like the availability of subsidized nonprofit and co-op housing, and evidence of overcrowded housing and rates of supply and vacancy, for example, and rate of home ownership. Next slide, please. And then we also have things like evidence of discrimination in acquiring housing, availability of reliable information in both official languages and other top languages of new arrivals about housing markets, and then level of knowledge of housing markets and how to obtain housing in Canada. We also have some of those more subjective perception indicators like level of satisfaction with current housing situation. Okay, next slide, please. I think that's it for setting the stage and the context. If you Google P2P welcoming communities, you can access the toolkit, and there's also a QR code on the slide here. That's it for me. I'm happy to take questions at the end after the other presenters. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And on to Carolyn.
Perfect. It's important to be able to unmute ourselves. Hi, everybody. I'm Carolyn Amantea, and I am the Regional Program Manager for Settlement and Language with the Columbia Basin Alliance for Literacy. We use CBAL as an acronym. And I was the former West Kootenay Local Immigration Partnership Coordinator as it was getting established in 2023. So I'll ask you to advance the slides, please. So the West Kootenay Local Immigration Partnership operates on the unceded traditional territories of the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Syilx Nations. Organizationally, though, we are spread out quite geographically, you'll see on the next slide, and we do also operate on the traditional territories of the Secwepemc and the Claydley Tene people, and we're very grateful to the Métis and the other Indigenous people in the region who care for these lands. Next slide. So geographically situated, we are in the southeastern corner of British Columbia. CBAL operates from Valemount over to Grand Forks and then right up to the Alberta border. Settlement and language happens in 10 of the 16 communities that you see highlighted here. The West Kootenay Local Immigration Partnership is in the southwest corner of that map, Castlegar, Nelson, and Trail. And our new East Kootenay Zonal Immigration Partnership encompasses along the Columbia Valley, so from Golden, Windermere Valley, Elk Valley, Kimberley, Cranbrook, and Fernie. So it's quite a new organization, and it is very geographically spread out. For some context, we've got about 70,000 people in the West Kootenay Local Immigration Partnership region. Golden, Windermere Valley down to Fernie is slightly larger geographically, but with a similar number of people roughly. So the next slide, please. So the West Kootenay Local Immigration Partnership was established based on the boundaries of the rural and northern immigration pilot. So we were one of two sites in British Columbia, the North Okanagan and the West Kootenay. It was a really successful pilot in terms of immigration and expediting that pathway to permanent residency for people, but the retention to the region was not as good as IRCC had hoped. So the goal of that pilot was really to have people stay in the region. And while they claim that it's very welcoming here, it's beautiful, there's lots of nature, people are kind. But once people achieved their permanent residency, we found they were leaving the region, maybe back to a larger center or somewhere else. And so IRCC actually had asked us to complete a feasibility study to establish a LIP in the region, and it was really quite nice timing and geographically speaking to focus on these three large communities. So when we introduced the LIP, I always said it was like selling a jar of air to people because it was quite new in our region. We don't have a lot of LIPs in BC and certainly not in rural communities. And so the Partnership Council was really perplexed as to why now? Why do we need to ensure that people are staying in this community? And aren't we already welcoming enough? So we really needed to sort of establish our community plan and help to get a sense of what would make this region more welcoming and improve the retention of our immigrants. The next slide, please. So in one of our first meetings, we used the first tool, so the environmental scan, and both our Partnership Council, which is that table of service providers, municipal leaders, and then the Newcomer Advisory Committee, they both completed the exercise. We brainstormed first the definition of welcoming in the context of a community. And it was actually very interesting to hear the differences between people who are immigrants to the region or even newcomers from other parts of Canada who were born in Canada. They had a very different definition of what welcoming might look like to people who live here already. We chose a subset of the questions from the toolkit that would lend themselves best to the formation of our community plan. So we were quite strategic. You can see on the right-hand side there, we chose 1, 2, 7, 9, 10, 11, and 12, just to sort of get that baseline work underway. Participants were placed in the 4 groups, so those 3 hub communities of Nelson, Castlegar, and Trail. Rossland is right next to Trail. It's 8 kilometers up the hill, and it's sort of encompassed as part of our operating region, but it is a very unique, sort of more of a resort-type municipality with fewer direct services. So we actually asked people from Rossland to complete the exercise for that community as well. I think if one larger municipality were to use this, you could easily group by neighborhood. Because we know sometimes in large areas, neighborhoods can be quite different to one another in terms of their resources and their demographics. The answers that came out of this were very different to one another, actually. So from a newcomer perspective and then from a service providing perspective, it was quite a range of answers that we had to sort of dissolve down to inform our community plan. Get to the next slide. The most fun, I think, was the characteristics ranking. So I actually printed them directly off of the website and cut them into strips. It's really hard to just see a list on paper. So we had cluster A with all of its strips and cluster B and cluster C. And we broke people into those groups again. So we took about 90 minutes actually, and some of them didn't even finish the task. It was quite a rich discussion. You can see a very small summary here of cluster A. And what was noticeable to us was that many of the partnership council members prioritize the perceptions. So you'll see that language perceptions further on in the toolkit, but positive attitudes, ongoing commitment to anti-racism and anti-oppression, things that are a little bit harder to measure. The newcomers actually really focused on infrastructure and systems, so housing and employment and transportation. So when you have to put those side by side and choose your 2 top priorities, it was actually a little bit tricky. We did present the results from each other, from the Partnership Council to the Newcomer Advisory, and then from the Newcomer Advisory back to the Partnership Council, and had some discussion about that and why that might be. So at the end, we took the first 2 priorities from each of the 3 clusters and brought them back to the table. I'll ask you for the next slide. So we tried to come up with some key indicators on our own, because I think a toolkit is just that, but there could have been some really great ideas that came out of those discussions. And there were certainly, it's a little bit hard for people, I think, who don't participate in research and data gathering as a career to sort of think of some great key performance indicators. So we did actually pick some of the ones that were most easily achievable, I think, from the toolkit, that third piece, to sort of help to frame the discussion a little bit further. And as we were looking to sort of utilize this mostly to develop our community plan, so for those who aren't in the local immigration partnership business, it's like a strategic plan. We took those questions, determined that the surveys and focus groups would actually be the most effective way to evaluate the work of the LIP. We hear a lot about attribution in the LIP world, and I think in the settlement world. So is a community actually becoming better in this area? So in this case, in becoming a welcoming region, is that directly attributable to the work of the local immigration partnership? And I think that's where we have to be a little bit careful in sort of patting ourselves on the back to say that this LIP has improved the region in the sense of its welcoming. We did actually experience a lot of survey fatigue when we disseminated those surveys, and our responses were a bit lower than we had hoped. We're now sort of considering doing surveys and more data gathering at community events via email, which is maybe going to be useful. So now we're 2.5 years in, and it's definitely time to revisit that toolkit and see what we've achieved in the region. We know that community building and systemic change really takes a long time, and it can be tricky to measure. So Leah alluded to it, and I like to use a spaghetti noodle analogy. If you imagine a wet noodle and you're pushing it up a wall, it goes along straight for a while, and then it falls back and it makes a bend. And it's, is 2.5 years long enough? Is it too short? Is it too long? How often should we be measuring the temperature of our community, I suppose? I would say that there's also a little bit of a disadvantage to LIPs, ZIPs, and RIFs right now with the funding restrictions imposed by the newest contract that was issued by IRCC. Of course, the work of the LIP is very important, but they've taken the community level research out of the hands of many of the LIPs and put it bigger to the umbrella organizations. For those of us in rural communities, there's a lot of context that goes along with local data gathering, I would say. Some of the census regions don't necessarily bound within our operating region. And so, we'll try to do the research as best we can with the resources provided. I do have to say that the toolkit and its components were so useful to frame the conversation, particularly with being a new LIP. It really gave the Partnership Council and the Newcomer Advisory Committee a great deal of food for thought, I would say, in terms of evaluating whether or not we are actually properly welcoming newcomers to our region. I really am looking forward to, Alina, and good news to hear about the data that's available to us and surveys and other resources provided by P2P. But I would encourage you, if you're looking at that toolkit and it seems really big and unwieldy, to scale it to what suits you. I didn't, there was no sort of pushback from P2P in using it in that way. I think it's a very simple tool to use. It's very clean language, and I look forward to hearing how other people might have used it moving forward. So thank you for asking me to talk about the LIP and our perspective.
Great. Well, thank you, Carolyn. And now we're going to get into talking about how to get data to actually measure the characteristics, and just some ideas for how you, as people who are interested in measuring these characteristics, can obtain data in different ways. So we'll start with Alina, who will talk about publicly available or subscription-based data availability. And over to you, Alina.
Thank you, Vicky. So yes, hi everyone. My name is Alina, and thank you so much for being here. As Vicky just mentioned, so I will be presenting today on data sources for measuring welcoming communities. So yeah, if we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So there are several data sources that can support the measurement of welcoming community characteristics, and as Vicky has just mentioned, some of them are publicly available. Others are available to LIPs or through subscriptions. So today I will show examples from several sources. These include the LIP data website, the immigration data portal of the Community Data Program, Statistics Canada, IRCC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and the Environics Institute. It's important to note this is not an exhaustive list. The goal is just to provide you with some examples today. So throughout the presentation, I will focus on how specific indicators from these sources can help measure selected indicators from the toolkit. Next slide, please. So before looking at specific sources, I want to highlight three things. First, when you look at when you look for available data, it is important to keep in mind the group you want to focus on. So, for example, you may be interested in all immigrants or recent immigrants or another specific group. So that may affect which data sources and indicators you can use, because some analyses require cross-tabulations, for example, by period of immigration or another demographic characteristic. The second point I want to make is that the geographic level can vary depending on the source and the indicator. So not all sources provide data at the same level. And even within the same source, the available geography may differ from one indicator to another. And finally, depending on the data set, indicators may be available for different kinds of geographies. So these can include administrative geographies, thinking about provinces, territories, census divisions, census subdivisions, or statistical geographies such as CMAs or CAs, or custom geographies depending on your RIF or LIP area. So these are important things to keep in mind when looking for data or selecting data to do this kind of measurement work. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So the next few slides that I will show you cover different characteristics of the Welcoming Communities Toolkit. Here we have the first characteristic, access to affordable and adequate and suitable housing. And on each slide, I've created a table with 3 columns. So on the left, you will find selected toolkit indicators. In the middle column, you will find a relevant data indicator that I've selected. And on the right side, on the source, you can find the source for that data indicator, which is also hyperlinked, unless it is from the libdata website or the CDP program, for which I've included links in one of the previous slides, so you can find the links there. So let's now take a look at the information on this slide. Here we have a few useful data indicators from the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation and the census, access to the libdata website, and the community data program. So the first toolkit indicator shown here is rate of core housing need. And one relevant data indicator for that is core housing need, measured as the number or percentage of immigrant-led households in core housing need, with an option also to look at this by immigration period. Another relevant indicator is individuals living in a home that does not meet housing standards. This looks at the number or percentage of immigrants living in housing that needs major repairs, is overcrowded, is unaffordable, or does not meet one or more housing standards. Now, the second toolkit indicator shown here is housing affordability, so the second row. And a relevant data indicator here is affordability, measured as whether 30% or more of household income is spent on shelter costs. And again, to get this indicator specifically for immigrants, the data has to be cross-tabulated by immigrant status. Next slide, please. So this slide continues with the same characteristic, access to affordable, adequate, and suitable housing. And then here again, there are a few useful indicators from the census and from the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation. The first toolkit indicator shown here is rate of home ownership, and the relevant data indicator here is household tenure. So this looks at the number or percentage of immigrants who own their dwelling or who rent. Then we have the next toolkit indicator looking at the availability of subsidized nonprofit or co-op housing. And the relevant data indicator here is social and affordable rental housing units. This includes the number of units, the number of vacant units, and average rents. And finally, the last toolkit indicator on this slide is the rate of supply and vacancy of suitable housing. A relevant data indicator here is the rental market indicators. And these include vacancy rates and average rents for rental condominium apartments and private apartments in the rental market survey. And yeah, it is important to note that for the CMHC indicators, so the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation indicators on this slide, these are not immigrant specific, but nevertheless, they're still useful for understanding the broader housing context in a community. Next slide, please. So this slide shows another characteristic of the toolkit. So we have the employment and entrepreneurship opportunities characteristic here. And there are several useful indicators from the census that we can use to measure these characteristics. For example, the first toolkit indicator shown here is rate of employment of working age immigrants. And a relevant data indicator for this is the employment rate. This tells us what percentage of immigrants age 15 and over are employed. And it is also possible to add some context by looking at whether that employment is part-time or full-time. Then we can also look at the rate and duration of unemployment of the working age immigrant population. The relevant data indicator here is the unemployment rate. Again, this tells us the percentage of immigrants age 15 and over that are unemployed. And finally, to look at the rate of self-employment, there is a relevant data variable, a data indicator called class of worker. And this makes it possible to look at the percentage of immigrants who are self-employed. Next slide, please. So this slide shows 2 additional indicators for the employment and entrepreneurship opportunities characteristic. So both also are based on census data. The Toolkit indicator shown here is rate of underemployment, including percent overqualified for the work they do, and rate of employment in lower skilled jobs. So one relevant data indicator is occupation, based on the National Occupational Classification, or NOC. So this makes it possible to look at the occupational distribution of employed immigrants. In other words, it shows the kinds of jobs immigrants are working in. And if the goal is to look more closely at overqualification, this can be combined with highest level of education, so another cross-tabulation. So this just shows the importance of looking at indicators by demographic characteristics as well. The second relevant data indicator is occupation by tier category. So tier refers to training, education, experience, and responsibilities usually associated with an occupation. So this helps group occupations by skill level. So this can be useful when looking at whether immigrants are concentrated in lower skilled jobs. Next slide, please. So this slide now focuses on another characteristic, access to suitable healthcare, including mental health care. And here there are a few useful indicators from the Canadian Community Health Survey. So the first Toolkit indicator shown here is self-perceived physical health, and a relevant data indicator is perceived health. So this looks at the percentage of immigrants who report very good or excellent health and the percentage who report fair or poor health. Then we have a similar indicator for self-perceived mental health, again looking at the percentage of immigrants who report very good or excellent mental health, or the percentage who report fair or poor mental health. The third Toolkit indicator here is rate of self-perceived unmet mental health care needs. So the relevant data indicator here makes it possible to look at the percentage of immigrants whose mental health needs are met, partially met, or not met. One thing that I want to mention here, so in terms of geography, what is highlighted on this slide is what is publicly available in the sources used here, so the hyperlinked sources in the source column. The CCHS itself is designed to support analysis below the provincial level, so including at the level of health regions. And there is a free 2022 public use microdata file that can be downloaded, which includes like a grouped health region variable as well as a variable to identify immigrant status. So that file also includes some of these indicators on the slide. So if a more specific like regional breakdown is needed, this type of analysis can also be done. And of course, if a specific analysis or a variable is not necessarily available through public files, there's always also the option to contact Statistics Canada directly and maybe to ask for a custom tabulation or some other way to access data. Next slide, please. So here we have one more indicator from the Canadian Community Health Survey. This looks at the availability and accessibility of suitable healthcare services and providers. And one relevant data indicator here is whether immigrants have a regular healthcare provider. This makes it possible to look at the percentage of immigrants who report having a regular doctor or healthcare provider. And then again, as on the previous slide, so the geography shown here reflects what is publicly available in the source used here on this slide, which is by geographical region. But the public use microdata file would also allow for analysis at the health region level if that is desired. Next slide, please. So the next characteristic is positive attitudes towards immigrants of all racial, cultural, and religious backgrounds. So this slide gives two examples of sources that can help measure parts of this characteristic. So the first Toolkit indicator shown here is rate of hate crimes targeting immigrants across all racial, cultural, and religious backgrounds in the community. And a relevant data indicator here is police-reported hate crime. So what is publicly available are the number of incidents and the rate per 100,000 population that can be looked at for provinces, territories, and CMAs. And when the number of incidents is broken down further by type of motivation, it is also possible to look at incidents motivated by race or ethnicity, and also at incidents motivated by immigrant or newcomer status. Then again, the geographic breakdown is not the same for all of these. So the incidents motivated by race or ethnicity can be looked at the regional level, and the incidents motivated by immigrant and newcomer status are available only Canada-wide, at least at this point. The second toolkit indicator shown here is evidence of positive attitudes towards immigration and towards racial, cultural, and religious diversity in the community. And here, a relevant data indicator includes public opinion measures on attitudes towards immigrants and immigration. So in this case, I've listed two examples of sources that can be used for this, the Environics Institute and IRCC. So these sources look at attitudes at the national level, but also include analysis at the regional, provincial, and territorial levels. And again, of course, these are just examples. There may be other survey sources that are also useful to consider. Next slide, please. So here, the next characteristic is access to immigrant serving agencies that meet immigrant needs. So the toolkit indicator shown here is the availability of immigrant serving agencies with a variety of services. And the useful source here is the IRCC Service Finder, which is a list of IRCC-funded service provider organizations. And this list allows you for a specific location to look at the types of services offered, the language of the service and the service format, for example, whether services are offered in person, online, or both. And it also allows you to filter for specific groups, children, youth, seniors, women, refugees, etc. Next slide, please. So the next characteristic we have here is access to transportation. And here we have a couple of useful indicators from the census. So we're looking at the toolkit indicator, looking at the availability of transportation options for access to regularly needed sites and services. So one relevant data indicator we can use here is the main mode of commuting. And this makes it possible to look at how immigrants in the employed labor force age 15 and over usually get to work. I mean, this is more specific and more narrow, but it's still useful. So for example, it can show the number of percentage who use a car, truck, van, public transit, walking, a bike, or another method. And this can also be then examined by commuting duration. So that's another relevant data indicator, looking at different options, meaning if the commute is less than 15 minutes or longer than that. So these indicators really can give a picture of transportation access, especially in relation to getting to work. Like I said, it's maybe a bit a narrower picture, but nevertheless useful information. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the characteristic educational opportunities. And here we have a couple of useful indicators from the census. So the first toolkit indicator here is rate of school attendance and rate of attendance in educational programs. And a relevant data indicator here is school attendance, which makes it possible to look at the number of immigrants attending elementary or secondary school or post-secondary education. And if needed, this can also be cross-tabulated by age group. Yeah. And the second toolkit indicator here is the availability of schools for French speakers in the local community. And the census here includes an indicator that looks at the eligibility and instruction in the minority official language. So this makes it possible to look at the number of immigrant children who are or who are not eligible. And for those who are eligible, to look at who has been and who hasn't been instructed in the minority official language. Next slide, please. So in terms of access to services and supports for French-speaking immigrants by French speakers, here I've listed again the same IRCC service finder we looked at earlier when we talked about the availability of immigrant serving agencies. So in this case, the service finder is useful because it allows to filter for French language services. So again, we can look at type of service and the service format and also filter for services for specific groups, all with that specific focus on French services. Next slide, please. So this slide shows an example for the characteristic civic and political participation opportunities. So here a useful indicator comes from the census, and it is Canadian citizenship. more specifically looking at the rate of citizenship acquisition. So in other words, it makes it possible to look at the number or percentage of immigrants who are Canadian citizens. And this can be cross-tabulated by period of immigration, which is useful because not all immigrants are automatically eligible for citizenship. So this way one could exclude most recent immigrants from the analysis and look at rate of citizenship acquisition by different immigration periods. Next slide, please. So before I reach the end of the presentation, just wanted to share some additional considerations. First, an important point is that for some characteristics of the toolkit and also the indicators, useful data may need to be requested directly from local organizations. So this can include school boards, municipalities, public health units, police services, economic development agencies, or immigrant serving organizations. So in some cases, local data may be available, but it may not be part of the public data set or the national data source. Second point is that some characteristics and indicators are simply not well covered by existing administrative or publicly available data sources. So in those cases, communities may need to consider developing their own surveys or using other local data collection tools, as Good News will also talk about in a moment. Yeah, and next slide. I think I have one more slide. Yeah. This final slide lists a few additional resources that may be worth exploring. Odessi is a Canadian social science data platform for searching, exploring, and analyzing data sets online. Some data sets are open access, so they're can be accessed by anyone, while others may have some restricted access, like may require institutional access. But nevertheless, it's a useful resource just to see what is out there, to see what different types of data sets, like ranging from Statistics Canada data, but also public opinion polls. There is a lot on that platform. The second one is the Center for Municipal and Local Data, which is a Statistics Canada portal created in partnership with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. So this can be useful for local and municipal indicators, including economic, socioeconomic, and health-related information. And then we have the Canadian Index for Measuring Integration, which is an interactive tool focused on immigrant integration outcomes in 4 areas, looking at economic, social, and health outcomes, as well as civic participation outcomes. And I believe it covers the 10 provinces and looks at 41 CMAs. And then we have the MTM Census tool, which is a subscription-based tool with an interactive dashboard that allows users to look at census data at different geographical levels. So these are not the main sources covered in the presentation, but they may still be useful to explore depending on the kind of data and level of analysis that you're looking for. So that's it from my side for now, at least. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you, Alina. And now we're going to turn things over to Good News, who will talk about using surveys of immigrants to measure welcoming communities. So over to you, Good News.
Thank you, Vicky. Hello, everyone. My name is Good News Oshiobele, and I'll be showing you how to use surveys of immigrants to measure welcoming communities. So I'm going to be showing you examples of questions that we have used in previous surveys. And but before that, I'm going to show you some important considerations. So just stay with me, and I hope you enjoy this section because we're going to go less technical and more maybe conversational, like asking questions and stuff like that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so before you go about launching a survey or conducting a survey in your community, it is important that you define the population of interest. This is where you set the boundaries. Who are you interested in obtaining data about and drawing conclusions about? So you might want to look at, let's say, newcomers in your community, and this will include temporary residents who recently arrived and permanent residents who recently arrived, or you might want to look at only permanent residents who arrived at a particular period of time. So depending on your questions, your interest, which are going to shape your question, you have to define your population of interest to your research or to your survey or whatever you want to do with the data you want to collect. So to do this, after arriving at a population of interest, it's important that you try to construct a representative sample. So how do you do this? You need to make sure that your sample looks a lot much like the population of interest. So you have to use random selection to arrive at it. And this includes or involves selecting eligible participants through a method that is not biased and will ensure that everyone in the population was given an equal opportunity to have been involved in the survey. So you also need to target for basic characteristics such as sex and age based on the proportions in the population. Next, you need to look at the sample size. You need to ask yourself, how large or small do I want this sample to be? So you want to ensure that it's not too small and it's not too large. And you need to make sure for many communities, the rule of thumb is 300 to 400 respondents. For communities with very few immigrants, the target should ideally be around 80 to 100 participants. Next slide, please. So your questions are also important when you are going about launching a survey. You want to make sure your questions are clear and not misleading, ambiguous, or double-barreled. So you should ask straightforward, simple questions that anyone who looks at the survey can understand what you're trying to obtain from them and give you the clear response you're expecting. And in this aspect, you also need to make sure that the language you use is something that they can relate with or they are more convenient with in terms of communication and understanding. So ideally, we would recommend multiple languages. It is typical for you to want to say, okay, we'll just use English and French. Of course, this is Canada. Yeah, we understand, but please ensure to look at the top languages that are used in your community because we have people from different parts of the world in Canada. So if you want your survey to be accessible to as many persons as possible, try to look for at least the top 5 or maybe top 7 languages in your community and put the survey in those languages. And then there are some do's and don'ts of disaggregation that we strongly recommend you follow. The rule of thumb is to ensure that there is a minimum cell size of 10, no less than 10 for any subgroups that you are considering in your survey. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are the examples of previous surveys successful surveys, that have used questions that we want to show you how you can use in your own survey. The first one is the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership 2025 survey. The second is the Surrey Local Immigration Partnership 2025 survey. And the third is the Waterloo Immigration Partnership 2023 survey. It is important to take note of the numbers because you're going to see the numbers in subsequent slides. When you see 1, it's referring to, it tells you that when you see 1 as a reference attached to each question or any question, it tells you that the question was taken from the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership survey. If you see 2, it means it's from Surrey. If you see 3, it means it's from Waterloo. So this is easy to understand. L is for 1, S is for 2, and W is for 3. Just in the alphabetical order, you can quickly remember it that way and just flow with us. Next slide, please. All right, so the first characteristics of interest here is access to affordable, adequate, and suitable housing. How can you construct questions that measure this in your surveys? So the first example you can look at here is, how challenging has it been for you to find suitable housing in London and Middlesex? Obviously, this is from the London and Middlesex survey. And you can put your response options like this or construct them like this: not at all the way to extremely. That's from 1 to 7. This is what we call a response scale. And you can also ask a question like, what challenges have you faced when looking for a place to live? You can use a checklist. For example, high rental costs, limited availability of housing, discrimination or bias, poor conditions of available housing, lack of knowledge. Or you can ask a question like, do you rent or own your dwelling, the place where you live? And the checklist could be something like rent, own with mortgage, own without mortgage. Next slide, please. You can also ask, please select the statement that best describes your housing costs: mortgage plus rent, utilities, insurance, property taxes. And the checklist would be, for example, less than 30% of households' total income, between 30 to 50% of households' total income, greater than 50% of households' total income, and so on. This is not all of what you can have on your checklist. Remember, these are examples. We're just highlighting them. So we are making references to the surveys. You can see that the number attached to this question is 2, which is from the SORRY survey. So we have the link to these surveys at the end of the slides of this presentation. So you will need to go to those surveys to see the full checklist that we are highlighting here. So another way you can ask this question is to measure access to affordable, adequate, and suitable housing. You can say, thinking about your current housing needs, please tell us how much you agree with these statements. My current housing meets my needs today. My current housing will meet my needs for the next 10 years. My current housing needs improvement or repairs to remain livable. I do not currently have permanent housing. So your response options here could be strongly disagree to strongly agree. Next slide, please. Now, the next characteristics you might want to include in your survey is employment and entrepreneurship opportunities. So to measure this, you can ask questions like, what are the biggest challenges you or your family have experienced in the last year in Waterloo region? Checklist, for example, finding work, starting a new business. Another question you could ask, how difficult have you found it to get a job in London and Middlesex that makes use of your qualification? Your response option could be not at all difficult, all the way to extremely difficult. You can also ask, why do you think it has been difficult? Your checklist options or items could include lack of information, employers do not accept your qualifications, discrimination, and many others. Next slide, please. Still on measuring employment and entrepreneurship opportunities, you can ask, what is your current employment status? Your checklist option would include employed full-time, employed part-time, self-employed, unemployed looking for work, unemployed not looking for work. Another question you could ask is, how satisfied are you with your current job? And the response option could range from not at all satisfied to extremely satisfied. Next slide, please. To measure access to suitable healthcare, including mental health care, we've used this kind of questions in our survey, and you can construct yours in this pattern. For example, over the past year, what are some of the biggest challenges you or your family have experienced in Surrey? Checklists, finding healthcare, finding mental health care. Another question could be, why would you leave London and Middlesex? Checklist, inability to obtain appropriate health care. And you can also ask, please rate your experience with the following community services in the last 12 months in Waterloo region. Health, mental health, you could rate from poor health to excellent health, or poor service provision to excellent service provision. Next slide, please. Okay, to measure positive attitudes toward immigrants of all racial, cultural, and religious backgrounds, you can ask questions like, please rate your level of satisfaction with the following related to your sense of belonging: the respect and value that community members have given to immigrants in Surrey, connections between immigrants and long-term residents of Surrey. You could rate from very dissatisfied to very satisfied. And you could also ask a question like, in the past 3 years, or since you came to London and Middlesex, if you have been here less than 3 years, to what extent have you experienced discrimination or been treated unfairly in London and Middlesex because of who you are? And the response option could be not at all to an extreme extent. Next slide, please. To measure access to immigrant serving agencies that meet immigrants' needs, examples of questions you could ask include, overall, how easy has it been for you to get the services you need to settle in London and Middlesex? Response options could range from not at all easy to extremely easy. Another question is, have you experienced any of the following problems or difficulties in getting the help you need to settle in London and Middlesex? And the checklist options could include lack of information or awareness of services, lack of services in your local community, language difficulties, and lack of childcare. You can also ask, how well have these settlement services met your needs? You list the settlement services that you have in your community. And then the response option would be, did not meet my needs, or up to the level of fully met my needs for each service. Next slide, please. You can also ask, thinking about your experience with agency staff, please tell us how much you agree with the following statements. Staff show respect for cultural differences. Staff are patient with language barriers. staff are sensitive to religious needs. Your response option could range from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Another way you can ask a question about this characteristic is, how often have the following supports been available when you have used services? List of supports could include childcare, interpretation, accessibility, and the response option could be something like never all the way to always for each support. Next slide, please. Now, if you want to assess transportation in your community, so how accessible is transportation in this community? You can ask questions like, over the past year, what are some of the biggest challenges you or your family have experienced in Surrey? The checklist option would include transportation because you want to know whether transportation is a challenge in your community. And another example could be, why would you leave London and Middlesex? And you could include poor public transportation as a reason, just to know if that is affecting accessibility in terms of transportation in your community. Another question you could frame your question like this. Please rate your experience with the following community services in the last 12 months in Waterloo region. Transportation services, and you can list other services that are related to transportation that you may have. So this is not like the only option to consider. And your range of options could be poor all the way to excellent. Next slide, please. So if you want to assess to measure access to services and supports for French-speaking immigrants by French speakers. This is important when you are asking French-speaking immigrants, your survey is asking questions that are designed for French-speaking immigrants. So you can say something like, overall, how easy has it been for you to get the services you need to settle in London and Middlesex? And the options could include not at all easy, all the way to extremely easy. And you can also ask, have you experienced any of the following problems or difficulties in getting the help you need to settle in London and Middlesex? You provide a checklist that could include items like lack of information or awareness of services, lack of services in your local community, and a lot more. You can also ask, how well have these settlement services met your needs? You list the settlement services that you have in your community, and you provide response options for each service, such as did not meet my needs all the way to fully met my needs. Next slide, please. You can also ask, thinking about your experience with agency staff, please tell us how much you agree with the following statements. Staff show respect for cultural differences. Staff are sensitive to religious needs. Strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree. It's an example of the response option you could have. You can also ask, how often have the following supports been available when you have used services? You list the support services that you have, which could include childcare and accessibility, and your response option could be never all the way to always for each support. Next slide, please. So to measure opportunities to form and join social and community networks, you can ask questions like, within the last year or since you came to London and Middlesex, if you have been here less than 1 year, were you a member or participants in, you provide a checklist of the community networks that you have in your community, and this could include sports or recreational club or organization, hobby club or organization, service clubs, youth club or groups, seniors club or groups, and many more. You can also ask, to what extent have you encountered challenges in building relationships in London and Middlesex? Not at all the way to extremely. You can also ask, how much have you felt isolated or alone over the last 12 months in Waterloo region? Not at all the way to a great deal. Next slide, please. So you can also ask, to what extent do you feel a sense of belonging to your neighborhood? In this case, London and Middlesex. You have to put the name of your neighborhood there, of course. And then the response options will include not at all the way to extremely. And then you can also ask, please rate your level of satisfaction with the following related to your sense of belonging: availability and quality of local events and activities in Surrey, availability, quality, and openness of social and community networks in Surrey. And the response option could be very dissatisfied to very satisfied. So next slide, please. Now, access to inclusive public spaces, facilities, and programs is another important characteristic of a welcoming community. And to include questions regarding this characteristic in your survey, you can ask, over the past year, what are some of the biggest challenges you or your family have experienced in Surrey? And the checklist option would include finding programming in local community centers, arts and culture spaces, libraries, etc. You can also ask, please rate your experience with the following community services in the last 12 months in Waterloo: recreation services, poor to excellent. You can also ask, if you experienced discrimination in the last 12 months, in what type of situations has this happened? You can provide a checklist with items that could include these examples. While using libraries, community or recreational centers, arenas, while using public areas such as parks or sidewalks. Next slide, please. So that's all from me. And here we have the link to these surveys that we have taken questions from, just to show you how you can construct the questions you might want to use to measure these community characteristics. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you. Good news. So thank you to all our speakers for these amazing presentations. They have a lot of useful information. Let me repeat that the presentations and a video of the session will be online. So you can go back and look at it and take information from it. Thanks to our speakers for making this information so clear to us. If you later have questions for the team, this is contact information for everyone. And those are links to the toolkit in English and French. And this information will also be put in the chat in case you want to have it later. So now we'll move to questions from our attendees. And I'm going to start looking at the questions that that were put in the Q&A and ask our speakers to address these questions. So the first question for whoever would like to answer it is whether there are clusters of characteristics that are especially important for small, rural, and remote communities. And do these clusters differ from the clusters presented in the deck? Or would it be individualized depending on the community? So I don't know who would like to answer that. Leah?
Thanks for the question. It's a good one. I'll get us started and then other panelists can jump in. When we made the clusters, they were generalized across communities. It really was the only way to do it, which is challenging, of course. So we do not have a separate set of clusters that are based specifically for small and rural communities, but that's where we really encourage communities to take a look at their community, for example, using the great exercises that Carolyn gave us to come up with their own sort of ranking list or their own clusters. I hope that answers the question, and feel free to jump in if anyone wants to add to that.
Yeah,
Carolyn.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So there are definitely some characteristics that really didn't apply to us. So for example, we don't have Francophone services in the West Kootenay by and large. And so that, the work of the local immigration partnership or of settlement or of community is unlikely to sort of result in the formation of that. So those characteristics were generally ranked lower. There are things like equitable media coverage, representation, and content. When you have a once a week 4-page newspaper that goes out, it's really hard to gauge whether or not. So I think in advance of asking people to participate in sort of that ranking, it's really good to sort of talk about, in our local context, do we have, positive Indigenous immigrant relations and understanding. There are no established First Nations here that claim this land as their own. It's intersecting. We don't have band offices and things in the West Kootenay. They do in the East. So that's really problematic for our context. So again, I don't think there's any one cluster that's more important or one that we would leave out, but I would say that some of the characteristics themselves might not be applicable to that rural context. Transportation, again, funny things that are very specific to rural, but I think they're all worth discussing.
Great, thank you. Maybe we'll move on to the next question then. And the next question was whether learning opportunities is part of any cluster. I'm not sure if that's then educational opportunities. Elena or Good News, did you want to jump in there? Good news.
Yeah, so it's actually part of educational opportunities. Like when you look at the toolkit and you look at the questions that you could ask and the items, indicators that you could measure, that is actually part of it. So yes, you're right, it is.
Okay. Next question. We no longer have access to the CDP LIP data, so I'm assuming this is from a LIP. I see that a lot of information is found through the census. Any other sources of data that we should look into? We already use the Stats Canada, data portal info. I think that's for Alina.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, so the community data program, I'm aware that the special like partnership through NLS to get access through it like that will come to an end or has come to an end. But I do believe that there is an option for a small annual fee to still buy or purchase access to the immigration data portal of the community data program. So if that's something that's feasible, I would, yeah, look into that. And yeah, the other option is to really try to look for Statistics Canada data files that are publicly available. I see that you mentioned that you're already using the data tables in the portal. So those are the sources that are worth looking into, in addition maybe to the ones that I listed at the end of my presentation. So I would also encourage to look into those. And something that's maybe a bit more general as an idea that I can say is that many academic institutions, they have access to these public use microdata files. So if you can find a way to partner with an academic institution that has access to those files, that would be also a way maybe to look at options on how to access more data.
So maybe I can just jump in there and say that P2P is developing a new website. And one of the features we will be adding is Find a Student, where community organizations can link with students in their region and hopefully form partnerships where you will get access then to data analysis and microdata through the research data centers. So that is one of our goals, and it is on our list to get up and running. The next question is whether or how this aligns with the International Welcoming City Standard. So I believe you're talking about the Welcoming America standards. And if you look at some of the, maybe I can just jump in here and say, if you look at some of the priorities that they have, and of course we talked to each other, and when they were starting, we were starting. You know, some of the basic elements of or indicators for a welcoming city or the standards for a welcoming city do link with our characteristics, like employment opportunities and connections, I think, with the established community, civic engagement opportunities, etc. So there is some alignment. I think we have more characteristics, but some of their standards, I think, subsume more than one of our characteristics. So a little different, but also some similarity. Okay, the next question, can an RGI housing be called as such when they create a retroactive debt to clients at the end of their stay, charging market rent price, claiming loss of subsidy that wasn't based on income?
I think I can just, I don't know how, if I can address it directly, the question, but I can just say maybe something more general. So just in terms of the indicators that I presented, obviously I was focused on what's out there publicly, and with any options that you look at or choose from, like any, like the social, what was the name? The social and affordable housing survey, for example. With any survey that you look at, it's going to have a specific methodology, specific questions and definitions. So it's worth looking into those, and there are advantages and disadvantages with each of those measures and what you're looking at. So what I'm saying, this is a starting point. No method is perfect. And I think that's why Leah also mentioned earlier that it's important to look at multiple indicators and also this quantitative and the qualitative part, and also to look at the subjective experience, which would also feed into looking at what are challenges, what are barriers that immigrants are facing, such as more complicated situations where, yeah, housing is linked to some form of debt. Yeah.
Thank you. So some of these questions seem like they're not for us in particular, because this workshop is really on measurement. But I will jump ahead to a question that said, how do we access the toolkit? And Shannon, maybe you just want to put in the chat, and maybe you've done that already, the links to the toolkit in English and French.
Vicky, the other thing I was thinking, looking at some of the questions that may not seem directly relevant to the measurement, but they do make me think a little bit about the second toolkit that we have, that I know that is another conversation that we're not touching today, but we do have that second toolkit on how to promote welcoming communities, with lots of specific programs listed there as examples. So they can or could be sources of inspiration or learning that can be looked at to maybe address some of the challenges that are described here.
That's a good point. So the Promoting Welcoming Communities Toolkit goes through each characteristic. We're still working on it, so we don't have all the characteristics yet, and highlights promising practices that are targeting particular indicators within that characteristic that are out in the community, that some of them are international examples. So there is very useful information. That's a good point, Elena. I'm going to jump ahead to a question for Carolyn. To what extent is research like yours doable by a person with no particular expertise in research? And I'm considering engaging in a similar project and wondering if a person with project management background can handle such a project.
Thanks, Mo. I think it's very doable. I think the toolkit is super easy to understand and use, and I don't believe it was developed for researchers. I think it was developed, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was developed for people just like us. You know, certainly when you take resources like Good News highlighted 3 really great resources for the surveys. You could use those in focus group situations, depending on your funding to do that, because it does take some resources. I see 2 questions down, you've asked about that. But largely people want to participate in these conversations. You could use them in a community forum, for example. So my colleague Alice just had a community forum. It would have been a great opportunity to work through some pieces of this toolkit. I think when you come down to disaggregating data and, you know, looking at statistical trends, you'd have to sort of have some background in that, but that wasn't the work of the Local Immigration Partnership. We know that some people probably answered that survey more than once, just given the exact same answers. I think you have to just be able to use your common sense to sort of filter out relevant or duplicate comments, but it was super easy. You know, I used my hours to do it. Once the surveys were out, they were open for a time, bring it back and put the groupings together. I think if you do it in small chunks, it's very, very doable.
Great, thank you. Good news.
So in addition to what Caroline has shared, I think it's also important for us to remind our participants that you can always reach out to us if you have questions and you have doubts. That's why we shared our contact details with you. Okay, so everything we've shared with you is doable. You don't need to be an expert in research. You just need to be able to get yourself on the task and be open to asking questions and willing to learn if you don't know any aspect of it. And we'll be happy to assist you. You're welcome.
Thank you, Good News. And Maybe you want to also answer this last question. Do you know of an example of collaboration with the local university research department to conduct this type of research? And Good News is a great example of that. So the London Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership actually worked with Western University students to conduct the survey. That was one of the examples here. Good News, do you want to say any more about that?
Well, I think you've actually said the main thing. So I can only but add that we are just like an email away. So just send us the email and ask your question if you want to participate in a project. Or you can also check our website, like the P2P website, and see what's going on, and whatever you want to be involved in, you can always send us an email. And if we have the space for or the opportunity for you to work with us, I think we're always happy to work with as many persons that are willing to contribute to meaningful projects like this.
Great. I think we just have a few minutes left. I don't know whether we want to now open it up for people to ask any verbal questions. If you have questions. Mo.
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you. I consider myself relatively new in the field of the lips, and I've been to several sessions, and this is definitely from afar much more informative, much more practical, straight to the point. So thank you so much. It was really helpful. And yeah, I was wondering, like I have been asking these questions because like now with the cuts that we are all seeing around us, I was checking, okay, how can we still do this important work while taking into consideration all the cuts? So hence the questions about how much energy it needs and how much time. I will definitely be reaching out in the upcoming weeks. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I would just say to that point, Mo, the base camp, the National Lip Secretariat base camp, people are sharing resources like mad on there. And by and large, our community of practice is really, really open to sharing resources. Nobody wants to recreate a wheel. And so I would encourage you to pop some questions into that LIP base camp if you've got an opportunity, or email directly. There's some really experienced people in the field who have these tools already in place.
Any other questions? Okay, well, it is 2:28, so I guess it's time to wrap up. I would like to thank our 4 very highly skilled speakers who made things so clear for us. And of course, thank you to our attendees for your participation. As mentioned, again, if you'd like to review the session, the video and the PowerPoints will be posted on the website shortly. As Good News mentioned, we're here to answer your questions. We're an email away. So please do just contact us if you have further questions. And finally, I would like to mention that there will also be more P2P workshops coming up. And you can just join the P2P mailing list to make sure you don't miss out by going to the P2P website and signing up for our e-bulletin. Our e-bulletin comes out maybe about once a month or so, and it has information on what's going on. And again, it will be previewing new workshops that will be ongoing. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.